Alright, so today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite reasons to believe in the existence of God. This one, as you can see, it's called the Kalam Cosmological argument.
I can't see you because it's dark.
Alright, it goes like this. So you've got premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. And the conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, some of you might be familiar with this kind of layout. It's called a syllogism. How it works is you take the two premises, and if the two premises are true, they make the conclusion, and you can trust that the conclusion is also true. For those of you, maybe this is completely new, you've never seen anything like this before, I'm going to have a quick going over how syllogisms work. So, for some reason the best way to explain it is using nonsense, so I'm going to give that a go. Right, so this is another syllogism, 3 premises. All Beazles are Boozles, all Boozles are Feezles, Bongle is a Beazle, therefore Bongle is a Feezle. So that's plenty simple enough. So nonsense names and words, but this kind of describes how a logical syllogism should work. So you see the straightforward facts about these things. We've got a Beazle. If you've got a Beazle, then it is a Boozle, because all Beazles are Boozles, and all Boozles are Feezles. It's a straightforward fact, very simple. Then you get an example of a Beazle, who's one called Bongle, maybe it's this guy. So if you follow this train of logic, Bongle is a Beazle, so Bongle is a Boozle, and Boozle's a Beazle, so Bongle is a Feezle. It goes through the whole train. So if all these 3 facts are true, therefore the conclusion is also true. It's kind of like doing maths, but just with words. So you have to make sure like all the words add up correctly. Right, so Bongle is a Beazle, as you see the chain of thought there. Beazles go to Boozles, Boozles go to Feezles, so the maths of the logic adds up. And you have to be very careful that it does all add up. So here's another one, this one might be more familiar. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So very similar setup to the nonsense one. All men are mortal, so is very similar to all Beazles are Boozles. Socrates is a man, like the example, Bongle is a Beazle. So the conclusion, where was Bongle is a Beazle, is now Socrates is mortal. Okay. Right, so yeah, we can follow, see how they mirror each other there. Bongle is a Beazle is the same as Socrates is a man. Beazles goes to Boozles, man goes to mortal. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, all mortals are men. Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man. So the maths of the statements adds up correctly. Okay, yeah, I'm in the right place now. So it's just like the nonsense in that nonsense syllogism. So Bongle is a Beazle. Beazles make Boozles. Socrates is a mortal, mortal makes man, but there's a problem with the first premise because not all mortals are men. So because a mortal could be a cat or an antelope or a woman or all sorts of things. So that, even though it adds up correctly, the maths works, the first premise is actually false. So therefore we can't trust this conclusion, even though we know that conclusion is true because of other reasons. We can't trust it because of this syllogism. Okay, so one more. Right. All men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, Socrates is a man. So similar thing where in this example we see all men are mortal or Beazles are Boozles. Then we have Socrates is mortal, which could be Bongle is a Boozle, and the conclusion Socrates is a man or Bongle is a Beazle. And again, you might think it looks okay at first glance, but there's a very important error. Both of the premises, they tell us examples of things that are mortal, but then the conclusion tells us something that's a man. So there's actually a complete disconnect there. So the premises are showing us how to recognise a boozle, but the conclusion shows us a beazle, and the maths doesn't add up. So, yeah. Bongo is a beazle, boozles is beazles, Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal. So they just don't, there's no connection there for the logic to follow. And we've got no reason to believe that all the beazles are boozles. So when we're looking at syllogisms, there's basically two things there to remember. First is whether the two premises are actually true, and then the second thing is whether the sort of the maths or the logic adds up correctly. Okay, so let's with that we can go back to the Kalam, which is what we're supposed to be talking about. So anyway, right. So there we are again. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Okay, so we can see that adds up correctly. Bongo is a beazle is the same as the universe has a beginning. Beazles go to boozles. Things with beginnings goes to has a cause. Okay. Now where syllogisms can get a bit more complicated, the premises here, they're simple statements and they make sense, but they usually represent a sort of body of evidence. So even though that's a straight up sentence, you can just take it or leave it on face value, it normally represents a whole bunch of evidence, and if you were to explain that, you'd need to go through the evidence to say, we believe this is true because. So when we say all beazles are boozles, it means that maybe we checked every beazle that exists and we know that they are all also boozles. Or there's something about beazles that means they can't not be boozles. So something a bit clearer without using the nonsense language might be this. Okay, all lions are cats, Leo is a lion, Leo is a cat. So we're all aware lions are in the cat family. This guy, he's a lion. So the body of evidence is that we know these things. It's in the biology. Okay. So yeah, before the syllogism was put together, we'd have some background information on the premises, because it's easy to say a simple statements like this, but if someone asks, how do you know these premises are true? Sometimes you'll see a syllogism, it's straightforward and self-explanatory, but more often than not, the premise is just a summary of the amount of evidence. Okay, so with the Kalam, we've got two premises. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. If the two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows, because we know the maths adds up. We won't need any more. If we've got enough evidence for these two, we don't need any extra evidence for the conclusion, because it just naturally follows from those. If the syllogism is sound, it's proof in itself. So sound and valid, they might be words that you hear in connection with these. I'll say what they mean quickly. I'll try not to use them though. Valid means that the maths of it works, and sound means the maths of it works and the premises are also true, so it means the conclusion is true as well. We already checked the maths on it, we've seen that the maths work, so next thing to do is actually see if the premises themselves are actually true. So we're going to do that now. So we'll look at each one in turn, because it's the easiest way to do it. So premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. It's fairly intuitive. Things that begin, things that are born or created or made or have a point where they went from non-existence to existence, all these things they were created or made or birthed by something else. That something else would be their cause. And something that does not exist has no ability to make itself. So if something did not exist at one point, then there'll be no potential of it making itself, because that's just impossible. Something else would have had to have caused it to begin existing. In physics, this is called the principle of causality. Every effect has a cause. So the principle is very important in any kind of science. When experiments are done, scientists assume that the things they put together will cause an effect. They test and retest and retest with the same causes to make sure that it always gives the same effect, and then that's how they know that things are true. So without the principle of causality, which lets us trust that doing the same action will result in the same effect, we couldn't test anything in science. So if there was no reliable causality, then everything would be utterly random and we couldn't really ever know anything. So this premise in the Kalam, it's not only got a 100% success rate in being tested, it's also fundamental to the scientific method. So if P1 is not true, then science would be completely impossible. Okay, premise 2, the universe began to exist. So is this statement true? Okay, so does causality apply to the universe? Well, it does if the universe has a beginning. The beginning of the universe has come to be known as the Big Bang. I don't know how people feel in here about the Big Bang, but I've heard that some believers don't like it because they think it might suggest that God wasn't needed for the process of the creation of everything. But hopefully I can put your minds at rest on that. For starters, the theory of the Big Bang was first put out there by a Belgian Catholic priest called George Lemaitre. He had no problem with mixing his theology with his science, and it might help you think of it this way. Like if the Big Bang was a firework, it would need someone to design it and build it and then light the fuse before it went off. Once the fuse is lit, it can go according to the laws of physics, but it's not going to go anywhere until someone lights it up. Okay, slightly ahead of things there. We might come back to that later. So anyway, the Big Bang, this event is extremely well evidenced. Before Lemaitre and the Big Bang theory, the leading opinion in science was that the universe had just always existed and had pretty much just been the way it was forever, in a steady state. When Edwin Hubble used his powerful telescope to confirm Lemaitre's theory that the universe was expanding, the steady state theory had to be tossed out. And that led to further speculation about where the universe had expanded from. Because the expansion is going out in all directions, so the conclusion is that there was a central point that the entire universe expanded from. And by technical ways of measuring the speed of the expansion, they've been able to discover that the universe is roughly 13.8 billion years old, which means 13.8 billion years ago, every atom and molecule and all the energy in the universe was compacted into one spot called a singularity. And at this point, that's where the expansion began. So this expansion, it was the beginning of space-time in our universe. And before that, well, before's not really an accurate word because time didn't exist. But before the Big Bang, there was no space or time. And our universe was born at that moment. So leading cosmology expert Alexander Vilenkin did a huge study on alternative models for the universe, but he's concluded that a space-time beginning for the universe is the only available option. He said this. Do I need to click that? I think I need to click it. And I didn't write it down. There we go. It has said that an argument is what convinces a reasonable man, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. So, in short, premise 2 is a summary of the best cosmology that's out there at the moment. Okay, click again. It might come as a surprise to some, but the Bible very much supports premise 2 as well. We all know Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, so beginning of all things, which tells us very plainly there was a beginning. And you might be also surprised by the following verses that say God stretched out the heavens, implying the scientific fact of the expansion that's only relatively recently been discovered. So there's quite a few. I don't think this is all of them. So Job 9:8, for example, he alone stretches out the heaven. The Lord wraps himself in light with a garment. He stretches out the heavens. So this theme of stretching out the heavens is very, very much sort of implies the expansion that is seen in reality, as opposed to what was previously believed about the everything just being as it was before. Okay, so scientifically speaking, I think P1, premise 1 and premise 2 are flawless. So Christians often get accused of being science deniers, but anyone who denies the Kalam here has to either deny the principle of causality or the breakthroughs in cosmology over the last century. And seeing as the Bible is in complete agreement with both of these facts, we've got every reason to trust them. Yet for those people who don't believe and they like to say, oh, I believe in science as their excuse for not believing, I think this is a real problem. They have to ignore at least one of these important scientific certainties. So, as I said before, if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, and I think it's indisputable that they are, then the conclusion is also true. And it follows that the universe has a cause. Okay, so I think that shows that the Kalam is valid and sound, so maths adds up and it's all true. It's true and proven, and there's no way of getting around it. But you might be thinking, where's God in all this? The conclusion doesn't actually mention him. So that's a fair enough question if you're thinking it. Kalam is actually quite unusual as a reason to believe in God, because it doesn't end, therefore God exists. It has a completely different, it stands alone and it's kind of theologically neutral. We've only looked at scientific reasons to believe the universe had a cause, and there's no reason anyone should deny it. And some people do try, and we're going to have a look at some of the reasons they try to in a moment as well. But how we get from the Kalam, so therefore the universe has a cause, to God, we take the fact that there is a cause for the universe, okay, and then using deduction to work out what the cause has to be, I kind of do it this way. So if the universe has a cause, that cause must not have any of the properties it created as new. So where we said earlier, the universe is space, time and energy and matter. Those were all new things that didn't exist before. So the thing that caused them couldn't be any of those things. The universe, so that's, number 1 refers to the way things can't exist before they exist. So we know from cosmology that the universe is all space, time, energy and matter. So that before the universe, if before is the right word, because as I say time doesn't exist yet, there can be no space, time, energy or matter. So 2 and 3 look at that. In number 4, we include the scientific laws of the universe. So natural laws are thought of as descriptive of the way things behave, not so much prescriptive. And objects don't follow a set of rules. The rules are just scientific descriptions of the way that objects naturally behave. Big Bang cosmology tells us that matter, space-time and natural law all had their beginning about 13.8 billion years ago, and they all had to come about together. Natural law describes the behaviour of matter. Matter can't exist without physical space to be in, which is material itself, and physical laws can't work without time to play out. So space and time, they're inseparably linked. So all this interconnected stuff that makes up the universe is what cosmology has told us all began at the Big Bang. In number 5, we take everything from 2 to 4 and recall they can't exist before they exist. So if the universe is the ground for matter, time and natural laws, then the cause can't be any of those. And we only have 3 options then at this stage for what could be the cause. We've got numbers, concepts or consciousness. If the cause is immaterial, timeless and spaceless, then it has to be something abstract and or immaterial. Okay, so now there's debate about whether any of these things actually exist as immaterial objects, but this deductive reasoning leads us to conclude that at least one of them must be real. we haven't got any other options left. So probably all heard the Sherlock Holmes quote. He's the poster boy for deductive reasoning, and he said, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So we've got three things we don't know if they exist, but it's got to be one of them, so one of them must exist. So we have concepts and numbers. We can think of the number 7, but that doesn't mean there is a big sort of physical number 7 that dictates what it means to be the number 7. Numbers, they're these abstract objects, and they don't exist as real material objects, but they're very important in how the universe works. So, like I say, there's debate about whether they even exist as immaterial objects. A lot of professional mathematicians think they do. I'm not sure myself, but for the purpose of this, we don't actually need to be sure either way. The main problem with numbers is that they don't have any ability to cause things. They describe, but they don't make anything happen. When you add or multiply in maths, you don't create any new numbers, you just see how the existing numbers interact with each other. So even if they do actually exist as immaterial objects, they can't be the cause. So that leaves us with concepts and consciousness. Concepts could describe ideas, which could not exist without a mind to think them up. So given that, we could rule out concepts. However, the theory of Platonism says that concepts can exist independently of minds. So we're all familiar with what a chair basically is. And if Platonism was true, that basic concept would exist immaterially, even if there was nobody to think about it. What we call a chair would just be something that can be compared to the immaterial concept of a chair. But again, for our purposes here, we don't need to figure out if Platonism is true or not. Even if conceptual objects exist immaterial, they would be similar to numbers in that they can't actually cause anything, because they're not active, they're just they're not active entities. So seeing as concepts either require a consciousness to exist, or again, they don't really have any creative power of their own, then by a process of elimination, we're left with consciousness as our only possible option for the cause of the universe. So it's the deduction we've just been through. It leads us to conclude that the cause of the universe was an immaterial conscious mind that transcends time and space, has power and intelligence to create something as huge and complicated as a universe, and that basically sounds like God to me, and a very sort of basic description. So this is why, this is one of my favourite reasons to believe in God. Each and every step is extremely simple, straightforward, and it comes back with all the evidence that the world has to offer. I can't see any way of dodging the conclusions that are drawn out of it, and we can even go a step further with that and talk about how what is known as the double slit experiment in quantum theory is even more evidence for the fact that consciousness comes before matter, but we'll stay focused on this. But we'll have a look into that if you have the chance. So even though I don't think there's any way out of this conclusion, some people do try to find some wiggle room. So I'm going to go through a few of those now, and I'm going to try and find a balance between being brief and as thorough as possible. So first one. So the most common one you'll probably hear is this: well, if God made the universe, then who made God? So if someone ever says this, you can simply point them back to premise 1, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay, God, he didn't have a beginning. God is eternal, he's self-sufficient, and as he's got no beginning, then premise 1, it doesn't apply to him. He has no cause, because he had no beginning. There is a different argument to the Kalam that uses the premise everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, be it in an external cause or in the necessity of its own nature, and it has a similar conclusion. And that premise doesn't refer to a beginning at all. But it suggests that things either have a beginning and causes, or they exist because they have to. If something exists necessarily, then there is no possibility that it does not exist. So many non-believers would like to say that the universe exists necessarily, but as we've seen, the Big Bang Theory tells us just over 13.8 billion years ago it was not there. You might have heard of God being called the prime mover. So this phrase means that in a chain of cause and effect, there must be something at the front end that begins the chain, like the finger that pushes a line of dominoes. That would be the prime mover, who was a cause but was not an effect. It's the uncaused cause. So and God would be the prime mover of all reality. He simply exists necessarily and began the chain of events that caused everything else to exist. The universe could not be the prime mover because, as we've seen, it had a beginning, and so it's not a necessary object and it must have had a cause. And the reason we know there must be a prime mover is that it is impossible to have an infinite chain of causes and effects. You can have one that begins and then goes on forever from that point, but not one that stretches on to infinity both forwards and backwards in time. And the simple reason being that if infinite time had already passed in our reality, then we should have already lived out our lives, the sun would have burnt out and the planet would have died an infinite number of years ago. And we'd have had enough time to do all that. But seeing we exist right now and the future hasn't happened yet, it's quite clear that an infinite amount of years haven't happened. It's just logically impossible. So this illustration might help. I don't know how many of you are familiar with The Simpsons, but you may remember the time that Homer Simpson got excited about Greasy Joe's bottomless barbecue pit. Obviously the place he was talking about was an all-you-can-eat buffet, but what if we actually tried to imagine a bottomless barbecue pit? You'll see a hole where the chicken wings and burgers and steaks get thrown for customers to help themselves. However, the pit is bottomless. Joe throws the first lot of meat into the pit and it falls for eternity. The customers are only going to be able to reach the food if it's at the top of the pit. But in order for the food to be at the top of the pit, it needs to be resting on top of other food. And that food needs to be resting at the bottom of the pit. But this pit has no bottom. The food keeps falling, never coming to rest, and so no matter how much is thrown in, there will never be any for the customers to take. So now, if we say the pit did have a bottom, and it was something like 13.8 billion steaks deep, then eventually the pit would be full and customers would be able to help themselves from the top. So here we are at the 13.8 billionth steak in time, but if the universe had been eternally existing, the 13th billionth steak would be somewhere unreachable down the pit. A more interesting objection that is sometimes put out there is that they will agree causality applies to our space-time material universe, but points out that we can't know that causality still holds outside of space-time. Maybe the rules are different and it could be possible for effects to begin existing without causes. To this, first I'd say we've got no reason to assume that causality wouldn't still apply. So like I said before, the principle of causality is a must-have for us to make any sense of science, and it seems to me that the idea of an effect without a cause is just logically impossible, regardless of how physics works. So really, the claim that causality doesn't exist outside our universe, when we see 100% confirmation of it everywhere, is one that needs a bit more evidence to support it. More often than not though, they won't be making the solid claim that they believe causality does not happen outside of space-time, but they just offer the possibility that it might not, and that almost gets them out of their burden of proof. Although at this point, it's near enough admitting that the line of reasoning that gets you to God makes perfect sense. There's just an outside chance that maybe one of the steps might possibly, at a stretch, not be true. And if that's what they're basing their non-belief on, then there's a trough load of blind faith there. So there might be some that insist that causality has to happen within time, which again is simply not true. And I'm going to use a classic example to explain this. Imagine a bowling ball sitting on a cushion. The ball is causing a depression in the cushion, and now if you can imagine that the ball has been on the cushion forever, there was no point in time where the cause, i.e. the ball, existed and the effect, the depression in the cushion, did not. So through this illustration it's clear that the effects can happen simultaneously with the cause. Or maybe you could think of a train. You've got an engine which pulls a carriage, so when the engine begins to move, the carriage moves with it. So the engine causes the carriage to move, but they happen simultaneously at the same time. As long as the engine moves, the carriage will move with it. And one of the most popular theories to escape the conclusion of the Kalam is the multiverse. Our cosmology has informed our definition of what a universe is. So the universe is a physical, material, space-time realm that begins at a Big Bang singularity and continues to expand until its heat death. And given that definition, people think it's possible that there's more than one universe, and they're all neighbours, but somehow they're cut off from each other. So if you can imagine blowing bubbles, and you can think of each one of those bubbles as an individual universe floating around in space. You might be familiar with the idea of multiverses from various sci-fi shows like Star Trek's Mirror Universe, Sliders, Rick and Morty, Red Dwarf, and there's loads of others that sort of use it. So skeptics will say that we don't need to deduce any supernatural powers or abstract objects to explain the cause of the universe. They will assert that our universe is somehow a baby of a different universe, perhaps by black holes absorbing energy and forming new singularities outside of their bubble. And that way the cause can still be within time and be recycling energy and matter that already exists, instead of having the problem of creating new space-time. And I sort of think of this as a fairly short-sighted objection, because we started with the question, where does our universe come from? And deduced it must be from God. But the multiverse theory simply changes our question to, where did the first universe come from? And that doesn't really change anything, and the Kalam actually still applies and still proves that God was the prime mover. And that would be the case if we have a finite, countable number of universes. So some skeptics then like to imagine that there's an infinite number of universes in this multiverse and can go on for eternity into the past, meaning we never have to deal with a beginning and we don't have to come to God. And I mentioned earlier in a slightly different argument that gets you to God without a beginning or space-time, so that would apply there. With the one where things either exist because they have a cause or because they exist necessarily. So the skeptic wants to believe then that the multiverse is a necessary object. But could it be? Well, I don't think so. We already know that each individual universe is not necessary, so there's not really much reason to think a chain of them would be. And if we consider that all universes are destined to come to a heat death, and that on this theory the matter and energy within them gets transferred to other universes, the universes that die seem to stop existing. And I wouldn't have thought that an entity that stops existing could be classed as one that necessarily exists. But maybe it's that the whole multiverse as a system is the thing that's necessary, and it doesn't matter how many universes within it live or die. Maybe it is the matter and energy that exists necessarily. In which case we've got a different problem that we've kind of already gone over. We already covered how there can't be an infinite regressive events in our timeline. We need a prime mover, or else all of history will have already played out in the infinite time that it's had to do it. We need a prime mover who exists timelessly, outside of time, so we can have a beginning to the timeline that we are in, and experience reality in the way that we do. The idea of infinity past is simply illogical, and it contradicts the world we experience. But another reason why skeptics should avoid the infinite multiverse idea is that it actually lowers the odds of atheism being correct. Because on the multiverse theory, each universe is randomly generated and it can possibly have a different law of physics. And given that there's an infinite number of these randomly generated universes with randomly generated laws of physics, that means there's infinite possibilities for what can exist within them. So as long as there's no logical contradictions, then anything goes. So if there really are an infinite amount of universes, that means every fictional movie or book or TV show that we read and see here is actually a reality in one of these other universes. It actually happens. And that also means that there's a guarantee that in at least one of these other universes there's an all-knowing, all-powerful being who is capable of creating universes by himself. For us as Christians, that definition of God doesn't really work as it began to exist, but it's quite devastating to an atheist worldview who deny any such being, or the idea that they might have been created by a being like that. And of course the multiverse theory assumes that universes can grow and form and give rise to life and so on without any divine intervention at any point. So it completely relies on naturalistic theories such as macroevolution and abiogenesis, among lots of other things. It needs those to be true before it can even be logically possible. So, one more, Mr. Clicks on. So the multiverse, it assumes naturalism is true without first proving it. It fails if there's a finite or accountable number of universes, because we would still have a beginning and the Kalam applies. It guarantees the existence of godlike beings if there is an infinite amount of universes, and it fails if there are an infinite number of universes because of the impossibility of a past eternity. So the final one I'm going to go through today is nice and easy, and we need it after all that multiverse stuff. Some skeptics will complain that the Kalam doesn't get you to Christianity. It only proves that some kind of gods that could work for Jews or Muslims or Zoroastrians and various other religions. And if you accept this argument is true, then there's not really any reason to be a Christian. And they would be right to say that. However, it doesn't really help them much if they're an atheist. If the Kalam is true, then atheism is wrong, and so they need to kind of figure out then which religion is true, if any, and who is the right God. So for Christians, there's no problem there. There's several other arguments that do a similar job to this one, and they all give you little pieces of the puzzle. This one, the Kalam, it gives you a creator. The fine-tuning gives you a designer. The moral argument gives you a lawgiver, and so on. And all of these help to tell us something about God, and they all build a cumulative case for his existence. They all complement each other and feed into and out of all parts of reality, as you would expect God to do. All of these things we learn match perfectly to the God described in the Bible, and make it clearer that other religions aren't quite right. But for the most important evidence that does get us to Christianity specifically, it's the gospel and its place in history. The Kalam is great, it's really powerful, but the evidence that can carry the full weight of our faith on its own without a cumulative case is Jesus, his life and his resurrection. And hopefully I can cover that with you some other time. But just before I finish, I just quickly want to answer this one question that might be bothering you. Who created the Kalam? I don't know, but it definitely had a cause. Thank you.
The billions of papers have been written on observations of how the world works, but what do people say about what was there beforehand? Nothing.
It's all very. It's because it's outside of the universe. It's very difficult to read it and test. Well, it's impossible really, because all our tools are very much inside the universe and can't really get too far out of our planet even. So getting outside of what is our bubble of reality is completely impossible. So it does come down to things like deduction and metaphysics, where it's very theoretical. But where I think this stage of deduction here kind of rule out anything else. But as I say, there are people that try to wiggle out of it, but I just can't see that any of the wiggle works.
Is it worth saying how Lawrence Krauss describes what he thinks came before the universe begins, where he says nothing existed? Because partly because that what he's talking about is within the universe, is part of the matter that we're talking about, and then he redefines nothing to actually mean So he does some wordplay to just sell a book, basically. It's not. It does not. Yeah, there's not.
Like our friend Dawkins, what does he think?
I think he goes with the guy Stacey was just talking about, Krauss, because I think they know each other, and he's a biologist anyway, so he wouldn't really.
Does he believe in the Big Bang?
Yeah. Yeah, but that he wouldn't. So, I'm not sure where. Oh, he was. He came up on the picture there. His God Delusion book. His central argument is, who made God? But like, that was the weakest objection that we had. So.
He tries to do what a lot of skeptics say, and they say, well, we don't know for sure, and until we know for sure, until we get scientific evidence that God exists or some hard evidence, we should remain completely modest and humble about what we know. So he says, I'm okay with saying I don't know, and if Christians are honest, then they should just say, well, we don't know either. And he thinks that by us claiming that we have more evidence or more knowledge or more arguments, that Christians are being dishonest or showing off, and that we should take a more humble, scientific, we don't know kind of position. And I think even Lawrence Krauss says similar thing, like they tend to get out of it a bit like that by just saying, but we don't know, and neither do you for sure. So
that
therefore,
doesn't actually answer anything.
Yeah, it doesn't. It just diverts.
Yeah, it's like there's one thing where I said it's like a big blind faith thing, where like we don't want that conclusion, so we're going to trust blindly that it's not true, even though we've got no reason to think so. It's not. They give it all these words to make you think they said something clever, but they really just kind of weaseling out of it.
And then sometimes they say, but we don't know now, but science will prove it, because science, given that science has come so far and is answering more and more questions, in 100 years or 200 years, science will just answer all of our questions. And so they just basically change the belief in God to like a faith in science.
Yeah,
where
exactly.
They just think science has all the answers.
Because they would complain, like if someone says, look how beautiful that mountain is, God must have done it. They call that God of the gaps, because they can say, no, here's how erosion and here's the scientific method for why a mountain exists. You just jump to God for no reason. But then I think when they say things like that, I call that naturalism of the gaps, where they're just jumping to that conclusion even though they've got no reason, just because they've already decided beforehand that that's what they want to believe.
Would it be fair to say that a lot of scientists confuse a description for an explanation? So they think that because they've described how something works, that they've explained why it works. And actually, those two things are fundamentally different. And if you think, as a lot of scientists do, that simply by explaining it, simply by describing it, you've explained it. You haven't really understood the difference between an explanation and a description. So science says science says how it works, but the Bible says why it is, why it works that way.
There is a lot of that as well. I think John Lennox does he talks about when a kettle is boiling, a scientist can tell you about all the molecules moving and all the heating and what it is that makes the water be hot at the end of it, but it won't tell you that someone wanted a cup of tea.
There's two explanations.
And there's also sometimes they'll put forward an explanation that sounds good. They'll say, like, here's how we think it works, and then they'll kind of trust it. But then the next step in science is always you have to test it and check it and try and see if it actually does work in reality, rather than just being this sort of theory you've come up with. And then a lot of things, when they are tested, it turns out that they don't work. And even though they sounded good and it seemed like all the steps made sense, it doesn't actually work in practice.
I suppose that argument, it doesn't explain any living creature, because you can talk about geology and earthquakes and tectonic plates and all the rest of it, and the creation of things like that, and you can see that there are physical forces for all those things, and because they're inanimate objects, but it doesn't explain why you have people,
Exactly. Yeah.
or cats, or dogs, or birds, or
Yeah.
whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
there had to be something, you know, if you say, well, actually, there's birds to feed the cats, but then why were there cats? And
Yeah.
you keep going back, and you
Yes.
have to get back to the prime
first
mover
thing,
and
yeah.
the first reason why they were there,
Yeah.
and it doesn't explain animate
Yeah.
objects.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah. And that's why I sort of mentioned abiogenesis, which is a theory that again it's kind of a placeholder name for a theory that doesn't exist yet, where at some point there was nothing that was alive, and then there obviously are things that are alive now. So there must be a theory that plugs that gap. We just don't know what it is yet. But with God, it makes sense. With science, there's this theory. I don't think this theory is ever going to come about because it seems to contradict the way. Because the best theory they've got is that there was a muddy puddle, some lightning struck it, and it came to life. And that's like more of a fairy tale to me than anything.
So
random.
you
Yeah.
can't get consciousness from non-consciousness. It's it's not even. It wouldn't be possible,
Yeah.
and you can't get life out of nothing that wasn't alive previously.
No.
And so they've got that really stumps a lot of evolutionists and who aren't willing to consider the supernatural in their part of their. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, like science won't ever address the supernatural because science is trying to explain the natural, but they're constant. It's a constant problem for them to explain this. It's unexplainable without going to.
It's come to a point where some of them say, well, consciousness doesn't actually exist then because
Yeah.
we can't figure it out. It's like, it
Yeah.
must not be real, even
Yeah.
though it's like the most obvious thing. We're conscious of things. We know. It's like you can't.
It's just your neurons, Lewis. It's just
Yeah.
your neurons.
Yeah.
I was just looking at Isaiah, and it's Isaiah 40:28. That's just the way the Lord regards all this, because He says, "Do you not know? Have you not heard?" He's like, it's almost like, what's the word I'm looking for? He's like, are you just so stupid, all you scientists, whatever. The Lord is the everlasting God, the Creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and His understanding no one can fathom.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like the conclusion is, I like the humility you were saying, but actually there's proper humility,
Yeah.
which is acknowledging Him, not
Mm.
just like kind of sort of saying, yeah, we don't know.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's like, but He puts in questions, do you not know, have you not heard, sort of thing,
Yeah.
as if it's really obvious.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's the
I
point.
suppose, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, when they're saying about the humility, you need to have that humility not to explain it. Actually, they're not saying that at all. What they're saying is, we don't like your explanation,
Yeah.
therefore we're going to make out that you're immodest and and
Yeah.
all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So. And sort of denigrate the people who are doing it because they don't like the obvious explanation. It's not one that fits with their theory.
Yeah.
So.
Just to say that, Lewis, I mean, I take a different view on the age of the Earth. I think the Earth's much younger than
Oh, well, it was
as
the
you said.
universe.
The universe. Yeah, okay. Well, whatever. I think the whole thing is much
Okay.
younger. But I mean, that's even it. You know, if you take a much younger Earth view, all this still applies, doesn't it? I mean, it still has a beginning.
Yeah.
It still has, and interestingly, I mean, I don't know what I think about the Big Bang stuff particularly, but the first thing that created, that Genesis 1 verse 3, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Is that what they're trying to describe with the Big Bang? I don't know. What do is that what they're?
Well, I think it's in 1:1 where it says He created the heavens and the earth, and light's like the next step. There's kind of like elements, the element of light.
There's the physicist Dr. Hugh Ross who studies this very in depth specifically, and his theory is that when God said "Let there be light," He was actually separating the atmosphere on Earth. So
That's
before
day 4, I think.
Huh?
That's day 4, I think.
What? Let there be light.
I think because He says it twice, does He?
Well, the interesting thing about it, I mean, and this is that day 1 in Genesis 1, He he says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Yeah.
And the sun's not created till day 4, which is, and people say, oh, well, that's, that doesn't make any sense. To which I think the answer is in John 8:12, and Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And so the point being that from the very beginning, he is the one who gives the universe its light.
Yeah.
And that the sun is just created as a sign. That's what it says, a sign of him. So, which is why in the new creation it says there does not need to be a sun, because the Lord, the Lamb himself will be its sun. So Jesus is saying, I'm the light of the world. In other words, the sun, that's really just a part-time symbol of the light which I am to the whole of the creation.
But yeah, you're right. I think because what you're referring to there is where like the Earth can now see the sun, whereas it was there to start with already, but we couldn't see it, and it's just like because so. But it comes into that as well. It's like they can work together.
The other thing he said was about consciousness.
Yeah.
Being, I was just thinking that I am is consciousness.
Yeah.
So when he calls himself I am who I am, is that not the first thing of consciousness? Is
Yes. Yeah.
I am kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. We can't say that.
Yeah. So I think
From eternity.
in the Hebrew it kind of has the connotation. It implies being self-existent as well, and it has kind of a lot more, has all that implication, like you say, which is a bit more clearer in the original.
But it comes out of the fire that burns but doesn't consume the bush. The self-sustaining fire, because when fires, you see, Exodus 3, Moses goes up to the bush that's burning, and the idea of, fire needs fuel to consume, because the fire must feed on something. But that fire needs no fuel. It is the self-sustaining fire that doesn't burn the bush up.
Yeah.
And so I am who I am.
Yeah.
Or the Hebrew could be equally translated, I will be who I will be. It's just, my existence as the self-sustaining life is the bottom line from which all other existence and life flows. Anything else? Jean, you're a science teacher.
No, I'm just taking it all in.
Just taking it all in. Well, I know.
Taking it all in.
Yeah,
and
no, I know
letting
you've
it spin
thought
round.
you've thought about this a lot.
I think the big thing is this big word called faith. An awful lot of it is a step of faith. You're not going to get all the answers.
No, of course, yeah.
In the end,
Yeah.
you can work out everything you've said, As scientists, we can do a lot of things. But the initial thing is you step forward in faith.
Yeah, exactly. I
That's
think,
it.
yeah, obviously there is that. I think this important thing is to have a difference between faith and blind faith. So blind faith would be, I've got no reason to believe any of this, I'm going to believe it. Whereas faith is, there's a few of these things. Maybe you don't need this one particularly, but we've got the Bible, we've got Jesus' story, and that could be your good enough evidence, which is for a lot of people. And so based on how good the Bible is, that will be, now I'm going to base the rest of my faith on that. I think it's Martin Luther King said that faith is, it's like a big ladder where you can see the first 2 steps and you can see the top, but there's like clouds in the middle. So you're going to get on it, and you're going to get to the top, but you just don't know what's going to happen in the middle. And that's what faith should be, rather than not being able to see the ladder at all.
I think what's interesting about what you said and implied as well is that actually a lot of people who atheism is itself a faith.
Yeah.
So actually, when it comes to beginnings, we're all people of faith.
Yeah.
The question is it reasonable faith, or is it, it what kind of faith is it? That's the question. So actually, when it comes out as everybody believes something.
Exactly. Yeah. You can't.
Richard Dawkins, a man full of faith.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely.
Is that faith that? Sorry, is that faith that is faith that is consciously ascribed to, or is it? I don't think it's both really, or is it the devil basically blinds people?
How do you mean?
Because we're told that the person of this age, the devil, has blinded people's eyes.
Oh, you mean people like Dawkins? Possibly, yeah.
Because you can think of it just as kind of like, we just need to explain it better. We just need to kind of have have better conversations. But it can't just be that. It must be that
There could be some actual
it's a
spiritual
supernatural.
blindness.
Yeah,
or-
definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Because they'll look at us the other way. They'll just say, "Well, we need to explain this better."
Yeah.
I think that with the whole faith, like we just have to have faith. It just comes down to faith. I think that's it. It's good and it's true, but it doesn't wash with an atheist. Like you can't just, if you're trying to, you'll never get an atheist to become a Christian by these arguments. You won't. All that, and it's not the purpose either. You're not. This isn't evangelical. It's not going to change someone's heart. It's not going to move them to convert. The idea is to try and show that we have a reasonable faith and we take into account the evidence that the atheists use, but that we use the same evidence, but we come to a conclusion that explains way more than their worldview. So our worldview takes reality, takes what we know instinctively and all the evidence and science, and our conclusion just explains way better the world than theirs, and we're trying to put stones in their shoes. So we're trying to say, hang on a minute, we understand what you're saying, but we've considered way more, and have you even considered this? What about so basically they've been laughing at us because we've just been going, but it's just the Bible, it's the Bible. They've been laughing at us going, that's just, it doesn't wash with them. So we're trying to say, actually, what about your worldview? What about your arguments are even worse than ours. Like we're trying to get them to consider their worldview and the holes in their arguments. We're not trying to convert anybody. We're not trying to say, you should be a Christian because of all these arguments. That's not really the goal and we're defending our faith as well.
So one of the people I really like is this guy called Jim Warner Wallace, he was a homicide detective who specialised in cold cases. So his cases were closed like 30 years ago, and so the eyewitnesses weren't around anymore to question, and all he had was kind of what was left over to work with, and that was his specialty, and he was like known as the guy who could do those. And he was an atheist, and he decided, okay, I'm going to turn my skills to the Bible and I'm going to disprove it. So he had a go at that, and he started coming across arguments like these, all these sort of things. And he said he started out with, I'm an atheist and my intellectual hurdles are, does the supernatural exist? Does God exist? Did God raise Jesus from the dead? And he figured if God exists, then the third one's kind of not a big deal. Yeah, that's quite possible. So it's basically, does supernatural exist? Does God exist? He's got two hurdles. But then when he started reading the Bible, reading all the evidence in the Bible, finding all these different arguments, then he started seeing he's got two hurdles over here, but he's got 20 over here to maintain atheism. And he starts thinking, okay, this is looking a lot more likely now. I've only got two hurdles to jump here. I've got at least 20. This makes it so. When you kind of get people mentally actually considering it, then obviously then the heart change is what's important, but maybe sometimes the heart might follow, depending on the person, the heart might follow the head. But
it is quite important because quite a lot of stuff in school is taught as fact,
yes.
and that's a big problem really.
Yes.
You have to then unpick on behalf of your children what they're being taught.
Because actually the majority of society is not going to be a thought-through atheist.
No.
But more and more of society is going to claim to be an atheist. So, and it's Christians that are seen to be unreasonable because of the teaching of fact versus fiction. And I think, it might well not be that these kind of things are going to turn the hardcore atheists, but it's those ones that kind of have dismissed out of hand the Christian mindset as being unreasonable versus the atheist mindset as being reasonable.
Yeah. And I think it's like Paul teaches us that we should be able to defend our faith, and that means being able to answer the questions that the culture, that all the challenges that our specific culture at the time throws at us, and I know it's difficult, but we should be able to have some basic response in that, with obviously with grace and love, and not with the same vitriol that a lot of them throw at us back, and how we behave back to them. I did lots of debating on a forum years ago, and I was called all sorts of names, just completely unprovoked. I was called just because I was a Christian, I was automatically a bigot. I was automatically dishonest. I was just for saying I'm a Christian, I was automatically all these horrible names, and people would just completely insult me, even though I wouldn't insult them back. It was completely unprovoked, but just for being a Christian, you get insulted.
It was online, was it?
Obviously online, because they wouldn't say it.
Won't they?
But I mean, that's just the attitude. A lot of the attitude. I mean, we're evil. In some of their eyes, we're evil. We worship a God that allows all this suffering, and we're just as bad. We're just complicit in all the evil, and
it's strange, though, isn't it? Because if you don't believe in a thing, why should evil exist?
Exactly.
Well, exactly.
That's the next argument. It's like evil and good doesn't even.
People say there can't be a God because of all the evil in the world. You say, well, if there isn't a God, I don't know why you care. Should we do any other brief comments before I just close off the evening? I think we will stop there. Anyone want to say? Lewis, thank you so much.